engaged in long-term those wider politics in Europe at the time. I discussed that. But rather than me continuing on this thing, one possible time. It's going to talk to us about Allen Leeper.
Thanks very much. Thank you, Peter, for that introduction, and thank you for inviting me. And I'm really sorry we don't have a book to launch. The reason being that some of you may know Cambridge University Press suffered a major cyber attack in the early summer. And although this book is actually, you can read it online, they put it online, that's the first thing they did, but they haven't yet, I've been told, and I haven't heard directly from them, I hear through the Royal Historical Society, they haven't yet got their publication processes, printing processes running, insofar as they can accommodate such series as this, and of course Irish Historical Studies, which they haven't printed out. Now, when Peter mentioned doing something at the Institute, I began to wonder when I last spoke at the Institute. I actually don't think I've spoken at the Institute since I was a junior fellow here in 1974. I was thinking of that and thinking of the great American comedian George Burns, who in his 80s had a very successful movie, what was thought to be a debut in The Sunshine Boys with Walter Matthau. And I remember seeing him being interviewed by Michael Parkinson about this. And he said, no, it wasn't his first film, made films in his 30s with his then wife, Gracie Allen. And he said, they must have liked me because they asked me back. But I have to say that I owe a great deal to the Institute. If I hadn't been awarded that fellowship in 1973, I might have abandoned an academic career. Now, whether this reflects well or badly on the appointments committee, I leave to work out. As Peter said, the Leeper Letters edition arises as a byproduct of the work I did on Namier. I had heard of Leeper while I was working on Namier's biographies, but I hadn't paid much attention to him. I knew that he was a colleague of Namier's in the Foreign Office during the First World War. I think, knew that they'd been at Balliol together. But it was only when I went to Balliol College archives one day in desperate search of some contemporary evidence about Namier's undergraduate career, about which we only heard from reminiscences, that I really twigged that there was something going on, because I saw in the college minutes that A.W.A. Leeper and L. Bernstein, as Namier was known at that time, had been admitted by special dispensation on the same day. I said to must have mentioned this to the archivist, who said, oh yes, we have Leeper's Oxford letters here. Didn't you know? And I forbore to say, well, there's no way I could have known, because it's not on the college website, it's not on the NRA website, that's National Tobacco, not National Rifle Association. Maybe on there for all I know. It's not on Archives Hub. But anyway, off she went, and she came back with 4 boxes. They were shallow boxes, but there were 4 of them. And I fell upon these, looking for references to Bernstein, or Berners, as his friends called him when he was at Oxford. They were dated from 1908, when Leeper was admitted, or slightly before that, when he set off from Australia. He began the letters and finished, after tailing off a bit, in 1912, when he eventually left Oxford. While I was looking at them, and I did find a few things about Namier. I found out, for example, that he was a tennis. But it wasn't much. I think I put that in the biography of desperation. But I became entranced by all the incidentals that I was reading. And I've had this experience before while looking at newspapers in the 18th century, where you're looking for something, in my case, references to elections of one kind or another, and you see all these other wonderful tidbits that you can't stop reading. And I became, I'll just show you Leeper as he was. I became entranced with his depictions of Oxford life in the Edwardian period. The university itself, the course that he undertook, the way it was taught, the dons, and especially the students. And there were a large number of very significant people. This is the Oxford of its time. Top right is Balliol undergraduate crowding about after the lecture. Bottom left is 8 week, female guests. There were a number of really interesting people who were present in Balliol when he was there, and particularly historians, as well as Namier, as Arnold Toynbee. Heard of, even if they don't think much of it these days. There were 2 Regius professors among the undergraduates, G.N. Clark, James Clark, as he was rather confusingly known, who became Regius Professor at Cambridge, Vivian Galbraith, who became Regius Professor at Oxford, G.D.H. Cole, Douglas Cole, who was titular Professor of Economic History, and people like J.B. Black, who was at Aberdeen, I think wrote extensively on Elizabethan England, and even James E. Todd, the Irish man who school on the history of Queens, dull, I think, but very good. And not just historians either. People like the philosopher Hamish Peyton, the biologist and public intellectual Julian Huxley, the exotically named anthropologist Diamond Jennis, a New Zealander. He got the name Diamond because his grandfather had been a jeweler. His father then got Diamond as a middle name. So they were running short of Christian names or forenames when they got Diamond. But he made his career in Canada, and he's officially a person of significance in the history of Canada. Robert Barrington Ward, who became editor of the Times, and a number of people who have probably fallen out of public recognition. People like the biographer and historian Philip Guadala, memoirist Lawrence Collier, and the art critic Michael Sadler. But if you look at this picture, I have to. Leeper's at the back, in the middle, Queen's friends are in South Africa, and Bryce, more than one, and that's his name here. That's James Clark, and at the bottom right, that's an interesting one. Oh, Friedrich Bethmann Hollweg, whose father was Chancellor of the German Reich. And given that Namier was viscerally anti-Prussian, and given this is only 6 years before the First World War, and this radiant tension between England and Germany, his presence in Oxford with a number of other Germans is really very interesting. But besides life in Oxford, there were also detailed accounts of Leeper's extensive travels in Europe by rail, occasionally rail and bicycle, before he arrived in Oxford and during vacations. His sister Catherine was studying the pianoforte in Berlin, and he visited her a number of times. And with Catherine and her friend Henry Caspar, he travelled around Germany and to Austria. He also stayed in Switzerland, in Italy, in France, Paris, and 1 year Nice the next, went as far as Stockholm in Scandinavia. So there was a great deal of European travel, much sightseeing. He was a man, an inveterate sightseer, an inveterate tourist, always advancing, Baedeker in hand, to see what there was to be seen and report. And also a great opera goer and theatre goer, all sorts of reports he gave of stage performances of one kind or another, including having been to Oberammergau for the bidecennial performance of the Passion Play, staying with one of the families of one of the leading actors. He saw Sarah Bernhardt on stage. He saw Vaughan Williams conduct the Sea Symphony for the first time. He attended a concert given by Paderewski, concert pianist and first president of Poland, in which Paderewski, who somewhat comes across as a peevish temperamental individual, every so often ran off the stage when he saw there was a window open. Apparently it was a steaming hot day, and he insisted all the windows were shut. And when somebody slyly did it, he saw it and ran off. So there's a lot of wonderful things there. He was also a great sports fan, as we would say nowadays. He was a tennis player of some note, and all Australians do they keen on cricket. And I think that if there was one point at which I can move on, I decided that these might be it, was when I read his comments on the Australian touring team in 1909, which sports historians, that may mean nothing to anybody in the audience, now regard as one of the greatest players ever to leave Australian shores, and he thought they were pretty poor. So people like Richard Trumper and Warwick Armstrong. And true enough, when he attended the first test in Edgbaston, sitting with the manager, Frank Labour, whose brother had been his sister Catherine's piano teacher in Melbourne, he watched Australia get bowled out before lunch on his first day and then lose by 10 wickets. He stood himself spotting this was coming, and then they won the next 4 tests, one after the other. So I thought when reading this, well, these make a nice volume, and I photographed all the letters at Balliol, and then sat down to transcribe and annotate, so on, as really a project for lockdown. It soon became clear there was a problem because Balliol only had half the letters. The other half were in the State Library in Victoria. What Balliol had there was photocopies, and those photocopies hadn't been too obvious on first glance, but they were actually really not very good. There was cropping by the points, the side and at the bottom. There was some fuzziness sometimes, and some moved the photocopier, and there were fragments that were not in order. So thanks largely to Darragh Gannon, I was put in touch with the archivist in Melbourne, who got me very, very cheaply scans of everything. So I was able to put it all together and actually give Balliol what they don't have, although they don't seem to be making and saying thank you. But that time it's not being recorded. So when I started working steadily through the letters, it made me realize just how much there was, and I hadn't been aware of this so much. Quick reading, because I wasn't looking for it. How much there was about Ireland. Although Allen was born and brought up in Australia, his father, and that's him in his pomp, Alexander, was a new Australian, born in Dublin to a family established in, first of all, Ulster and then in Dublin from the 17th century onwards. The son, Alexander, was the son of the rector of St Aldwyn's. He had brothers and brothers-in-law who were barristers in Dublin. Lots of middle-class Protestant Irish, Anglo-Irish relations. Alexander had originally been intended to follow in his father's footsteps or to go into the civil service. But having been educated at Kingstown Grammar School in Dundee, he took a brilliant first in classics at Trinity, taught by Mahaffy, among others. And then it was decided in Oxford he would do another bachelor's degree, which you had to do when you went to Oxford, in Literae Humaniores, great, which was the degree to do. It combined classics with modern philosophy. And then he would go on possibly to be an academic. Before he went there, he decided he would take what we now think of as a gap year, and he went to Australia, largely, I think, through a connection of his father's. And he became tutor to the young sons of Sir Wigram Allen, who was the Speaker of the lower house of the New South Wales Assembly. And there, in the manner of some Victorian novel, he fell in love with Adeline Allen, the elder daughter of his two young the elder daughter of Sir Wigram Allen, sister of his two young charges, whose effect on his emotions was such that when he returned to Oxford, he simply couldn't settle. And after a year at Greats, he decided he had to go back to Australia and pursue Adeline. He took a job as a schoolmaster in Melbourne and applied to her father marriage, in which he was told, very politely, I suppose, to bugger off. I think that A, he wasn't good enough, and B, so Wigram probably thought he was damn cheap if somebody was employed, wormed his way into the house and wanted to marry his daughter. He then got himself ordained. He became the founding warden of Trinity College in Melbourne, which is an Anglican college. Still wasn't good enough. But Adeline was a tough bird, and she managed to persuade her father to allow the match. They were married for a relatively short time, and they had 4 children. And they are 2 girls and then 2 boys. And the 2 girls are Kitty on the left, and Catherine, which I find very confusing. My granddaughter Catherine, Kitty. Anyway, I think it shows a lack of imagination in the naming names, which has continued for the boys. Because on the right we have the elder boy, it's Alexander Wigram Allen Leeper, named after his father and after his maternal grandfather, presumably as a belated peace offering. And then in the middle, in the wheelbarrow of some kind, Reginald William Allen, named after the man who Alexander had shared a big first year as an only doctor. Adeline died fairly soon, I think, after this picture was taken. Alexander married again. He had another family. So the 4 children had stepbrothers, stepsisters. They seem to have all got on very well. Alan always referred to his stepmother as Margaret. I don't know whether it's actually Arch or what, but he was very fond of her, and there were no problems there. Alexander himself was a different kettle of fish. He was a very strong character who combined an indulgent disposition with a tendency to flare up if crossed. Difficult in personal relations, bore grudges, and as a result, his long period as warden of Trinity was marked by a succession of crises and quarrels of one kind or another. In politics, he clung to family traditions, meaning that he believed fervently in union and in the empire, which meant the British Empire, which made him thoroughly conservative across the board, though oddly enough, he disagreed with the Conservative Party in Britain's support for tariff reform. Unbending unionism translated into bitter opposition to Home Rule in Ireland, and indeed to Irish nationalism in all its forms. Being intensely hostile to the political ambitions of the Catholic Church, as he saw it in Ireland, he became suspicious of Catholics in general, and in some contexts found himself keeping company with ultra-Protestant evangelicals, with whom he normally would not have passed the time of day. He was also a resolute opponent of women's suffrage. Yet at the same time, he was no bigot. He welcomed to Trinity members of all religious groups, including Catholics. It wasn't simply an Anglican college. He favoured the social advancement of women, despite his hostility to suffrage. And Trinity was indeed the first college in Australia to permit women to attend lectures. Domestically, he pressed his political views on his children, giving them unionist literature to bolster their views on the great issue, Home Rule. Dicey was a favourite. And as a parent, he could sometimes be a bit difficult. So there are hints in Allen's letters of discussions on controversial matters, which sometimes perhaps became a little too fractious. Nonetheless, his forthrightness didn't antagonize his children, because ultimately he let them do what they had to do. Kitty goes off to London to become a writer. Catherine goes to, I said, Berlin to learn the piano. Rex is actually sent to Japan for 6 months to learn Japanese in preparation for the Foreign Office. Allen has a different destiny. Alexander seems to have projected his own frustrated academic ambitions onto his elder son, who seems only too happy to have complied. So after excelling at Melbourne Grammar School, Allen took first in classics at Melbourne University, Trinity, of course, in 1907. He seems to have been able to make friends easily. He was a very gregarious boy, had a particular talent for games, although he did have problems with his health. There may have been a dose of TB in his youth because he always had a weak chest. And so although he could play tennis, he really couldn't play other games. He never played rugby, for example. And when he was at Oxford, he thought about taking up rowing and then thought, too tough for me. And when he came to England, his parents insisted he see a chest specialist in London of their choice very frequently. So after his degree, it was decided that he would go to Oxford. Very fortunately, at the same time, Alexander was chosen as the diocesan representative to go to the Pan-Anglican Congress in London. Now, when I gave a talk on Allen Leeper to the Church of Ireland's Historical Society, I asked the question of the audience of what was a collected down to bishops, and I think the former Archbishop of Armagh, Richard Clark, said a confusion. And so I'm sure Alexander is in there somewhere in the back. But going to London in 1908 provided an opportunity not only for Alexander to go and see his family, and to revisit old haunts, but also to install Allen in Oxford. So they all got on this boat, the SS Bremen, in Melbourne, and they went by Adelaide, Fremantle, and Colombo through the Suez Canal and ended up in Naples after a long journey described in tedious detail, I have to say. And there's a lot about deck games, which I think is probably not the most exciting part of the letters. Once they arrived in Naples, Alexander decided the best thing to do was to take Allen, future classics Don, around Greece, and ended up in Constantinople, then came over to London by rail. Allen began at this stage to write letters. As soon as they left, actually, when they were on the boat, he started writing to his brother Rex, explaining what was going on. And he did say that he was writing these letters because he hadn't time to keep a diary and he wanted Rex to keep hold of them, which they seem to have done. Later on, when his father and stepmother went back to Australia, he wrote to them instead, and Rex indeed came over to Oxford himself. With his father, he visited family in Dublin, and he was to do this again on his own account in university vacations. He also spent one Christmas at Glengarriff Castle Hotel, then owned by a man called Simon White. And he was there with Rhys Carpenter, the man standing on his left-hand side in the picture, and Roland Bryce on the right-hand side. They were there because Bryce's parents had just bought Garnish Island, and they were about to build a house which came and the great garden, which Roland eventually went back to manage, giving up a career in the Foreign Office, which, according to Allen, was no real loss to the Foreign Office because, I mean, he was a nice bloke, but really was a bit dim. Now, although he thought of himself as an Anglo-Irish, or significantly, and he describes himself once as Anglo-Irish, Allen seems to have kept his Irish connections at a distance. His comments about Irish life are those of a detached observer. So he describes Simon White and his family. They're very nice in Glengarriff Castle, but they're rather, quote, wild Irishy. The society he moved in when he was in Dublin or in County Cork was entirely Protestant, his family and their friends. And his social life there, when he was not sightseeing, consisted of dinner parties, bridge parties, tennis parties, and so on. While his letters from Oxford are full of references to contemporary party politics and comments on life in Germany and other European countries he visited, include a great deal on a rather acute comment on public opinion, he'd almost nothing to say about politics in Ireland. The only comment which might be construed as political is in fact somewhat oblique. Once he was on a train journey coming back from playing tennis, of course, in Bray, with some ex-Indian Army colonel. And he reported that the carriage window had been broken by a stone, quote, thrown by a fortunately misguided Celt. Allen's sense of his own nationality was not at all clear, in fact. He was at pains to tell his father but he still considered himself an Australian, but seems to have become rapidly and willfully anglicised, and he certainly saw his future in the mother country. Little as I want to be accurate, I don't want at all to return to Australia. I'm fond of it. I like my fellow countrymen very much. Testing too much, I think. I see lots of them at Oxford, though I don't think I associate with them and neglect the really most interesting people, the Englishmen from the public schools. Of course, I know and like lots of them, and it's mixing with them that makes up the real interest and charm of Oxford. I am and always shall be an Australian, but I feel I'm interested in other things than what I should get there. He still supported Australia in cricket and especially tennis, so to that extent he'd have failed the Norman Tebbit test. And as he said, he naturally mixed a great deal with fellow colonials, as he called them. But he couldn't stop himself sneering at Antipodeans who spoke as they had spoken at home. This was an aspect of Stanley Castle, father was a Methodist minister in Brisbane, was pretty so-so socially. And he was equally disdainful of the social background of Diamond Jennis, whose family were, in fact, relatively prosperous jewellers in Auckland. He'd seen a photograph of the family, this one, I suspect, and described the family as startlers, whatever that means. It's hard to say where this snobbery came from. The undergraduates with whom he mainly associated tended to be the sons of academics, clergymen, and nonconformist ministers, or businessmen, like James Clark. And the self-conscious social elite of Balliol, old Etonians to a man, he was interested in, but didn't mix with. It was an attitude he may simply have absorbed without thinking, just as he claimed to dislike Jews and Indians in general, though being friendly with individuals like Namier or his sometime tennis partner Kanwar Singh, who was the only Indian you could see on the matriculation picture. It possibly helped that Namier and Singh were from apparently wealthy families, but it did mean that Leeper was gradually distancing himself from his Australian roots. He was, for example, delighted that people couldn't detect a trace of Australian in speech, and he quickly adopted the slang of Edwardian Oxford. I've read these references to things which he said he liked immensely, and then it only twigged that my mother had an aunt who'd been in service in this period, and she absorbed some of the slang of the period, and she always liked these immensely. I like them immensely. But most noticeable is that dreadful kind of Edwardian slang, which you see as the Prince of Wales, the Pragus Waggons, and the wastepaper basket is the Wagga Pagga Bag, which survives only in things like rugby and soccer and the athletics competition in Oxford University, which is still known as cuppers. So breakfast was brekker, lectures were lekker, the Radcliffe Tramway was the Radda, the Union was the Ugger, and the master of Balliol was the old mugger. I've often wanted to be introduced to the current master and say, "Oh, you're the mugger." There's a wonderful story about the old mugger, which Leeper tells. It's a variation on a classic story. The old mugger was very bad, gave very bad lekker, and he was lecturing one day and noticed somebody in the front row not taking any notes and asked him why. He said, "It's all right, sir, I've got my grandfather's." Where the apogee of this particular quirk of writing was, I think, giving his address when he was living in 9 King Edward Street off the High as 9 the Tedder Ocker. But while anglicising himself, Leeper always remained a strong supporter of the empire, which reassured his father. In other respects, however, he began to move away from his father's entrenched opinions. Now, he had to move very carefully on this because Alexander's volcanic character made public disagreement rather difficult. And you can see it in the way he writes about personal relationships, that he's very careful about what he says. He doesn't, for example, tell his father anything about the relationship between Sister Catherine and Henry Caspar until he suddenly announced they've married. And of course, this caused explosion in Melbourne. And he says nothing about his brother Rex and Rex's infatuation with a cousin, an Oxford-based cousin called Primrose Allen, which was very obvious to everybody else. And of course, he's very careful in saying anything which departs from his father's views in matters of religion or politics, but gradually it happens. First of all, it happens in religion. Now, Alexander was a fairly archetypal low church Anglican, even a strong evangelical in some respects, with a pronounced hatred for anything that might smack of Romanism. Allen was quite clearly in the process of transforming himself into an Anglo-Catholic, as indeed were his brother and sisters, with a pronounced preference for smells and bells over what he considered drabness of low church services. Complained about the college chapel, which was dreadful. He was one of the very few undergraduates to go regularly, and very clear about his preference for meaningful ritual, while at the same time putting in brackets that he didn't like meaningless ritual. Not quite clear what the distinction actually meant. Then there were reports of occasional visits to the Cowley Fathers in Oxford, which was also attended by another Balliol undergraduate, no less than Knox, Monsignor Robert Knox. And the fact that he and Catherine spent some time in Berlin visiting the Church of the Old Catholics, kind of cousins of English Anglo-Catholics, and the Jansenists in Holland. Then there was the tenor of his comments about individual clergymen, sermons he heard. He was never enthusiastic about anyone who was not an Anglo-Catholic, even if they preached well. And he was quick to dismiss nonconformist divines and indeed nonconformity in general, in which there may have been an element of social snobbery. So, for example, the Irish Chief Secretary, Augustine Birrell, he described as an example of, quote, the tiresome bourgeois nonconformist type, which I don't find at all attractive. He was much slower to admit shifts in his attitudes to questions of politics, which he felt quite correctly would offer his father even more provocation. Nonetheless, he does seem to shift from a position in which he says, oh, like you, father, I'm a strong conservative, but I don't like some of the things that conservatives does, as conservatives do, to a position which is rather more favourable to the liberals. So he begins by saying he can't be a liberal or a conservative, even though everybody in Oxford was. And then he says, well, there are things about liberalism that I don't dislike. The first element, I suppose, of the liberal programme that he says something nice about is the People's Budget, although, of course, he still disliked Lord George personally, as Welsh and from a nonconformist background. And then it's the House of Lords. He's in favour of reform of the House of Lords. And finally, he takes the step in describing a vigorous family debate at the home of his uncle by his mother's brother, Boyce Allen in Oxford, saying that he and Rex and Kitty, who were also present, took the liberal side. And if this wasn't bad enough, there was a subsequent démarche over suffragism. At first, he just repeated his father's views, reporting suffragettes and speeches and Speaker's Corner with appropriate disdain. But when Millicent Fawcett, the picture illustration at any rate, spoke at a crowded session of the Ugga, he made a point of being there and telling his father just how much it impressed him, though still professing that he'd actually voted against the motion she proposed. Soon afterwards, he suddenly declared he'd spoken and voted in favour of women's suffrage in the debate of the college society. Now, as far as we know, none of these provocations, the Anglo-Catholicism, the drift towards liberalism, the drift towards suffragism, provoked his father into saying anything. At least there's no reference in the letter to, I'm sorry you didn't like this. However, all that changed when he wrote about home rule. He'd been at pains to reassure his father that even if voting Liberal, he was sound on Irish matters. But during the Easter vacation in 1911, he wrote a momentous letter from lodgings in Paris, telling his father that he'd become a home ruler. He began the letter at 10:30 at night and didn't finish it until almost 2 in the morning. It's worth quoting, I'll keep my eye on the watch, but I think it is worth quoting at some length. About Ireland. Here more than anywhere, I feel that I'm no longer able to agree with my natural feelings of conservatism and dissent. If Ireland was contented and happy and prosperous under the government of Westminster, who could fail to be glad of it? But Ireland is not, and Ireland never will be. And in that fact, it seems to me, lies an argument which all other arguments, however excellent, fail to get over. All that was of importance to the modern, fair-minded observer, one, was present facts. Ireland is today a moral, intellectual, physical, and economic wreck, by which I mean that the Irish people as a people has no notion of responsibility for their political, intellectual, and economic existence. Their politics consist of anti-Britanism, neither more nor less. They're interested in nothing but trying to wrench themselves free from a dominant partner they do not like, who is high-principled and conscientious, of course, but as well as sensible, but unfortunately of wholly incompatible opinions, interests, and above all sympathies. Failing to wrench themselves free, they brawl and punch and scratch. The only way forward was for Britain to give Ireland a chance to recover her self-respect by setting her on her feet and giving her a small allowance to teach her how to behave like a nation, not an aggregation of savages. I mean, part of this is to try and appeal to his father. Practical measures to ameliorate the condition of Ireland were no good. They didn't address the main issue. Ireland wants one thing, the right to call her soul her own, the right to keep her purse with an English penny inside it in the way she pleases, the right to take her place in the empire as a gallant and worthy partner, not a miserable, though pampered captive. As for the objections to Home Rule, he dismissed the religious argument that Home Rule would be Rome Rule as a fantasy of what he called Scoto-Irishmen in the north, with whom he clearly felt little sympathy. Nor did he think Ulstermen need be concerned that there was any threat to their prosperity. Do Ulstermen give their neighbour credit for so little sense that to wreck a century-old grudge, he will drive out all the wealth of Belfast and all the industries which made County Down, and with it Ireland rich, and more than that, call down on his own accursed and stupid head the vengeance of English and Scottish arms, and at least the end of grants from the English Treasury. The end result of the passage of the Home Rule Bill will be that Ireland will have every chance of becoming prosperous and every hope of being happy, and Ireland's prosperity will be Britain's. England will at last be allowed time to manage her own affairs, and the last and only great blot, and I think this is quite important, on England's just empire will be removed. The effect on his father, however carefully worded, however qualified, was devastating. Alexander tried once more to convince his son of the error of his ways, sent him more pamphlets to read, and then gave up, stating that they would never talk about the subject again. Well, why did Allen take a position on Ireland that was so different from his father? I think there are a number of possible reasons. First, there's the fact that his own sense of Irishness was much diluted as he came more and more to identify himself with English interests. And many of the arguments he presented to his father were from the English or British or imperial point of view. In his visits to Dublin and Cork, he'd always been an outside observer. And while almost all his relations in Ireland would have shared his father's opinions, with one exception, whom I'll come shortly, he seems not to have identified with them at all, at least insufficiently to adopt their prejudices. It's possible that there was something in his increasing Anglo-Catholicism that made him less anxious about Home Rule. Certainly his negative portrayal of Ulster Protestants was of a piece with his dislike of English nonconformity. And despite any superficial paradox, there was also, of course, a strong link between Anglo-Catholicism and left-wing, even socialist policy. We've also to consider, I think, the influence of the circles in which he'd been moving at Oxford. He told his father, and this wouldn't have gone down well, that all the dons and all the coming men here are Home Rulers. Balliol as a college had a socially progressive ethos. There were reactionary dons, of course, but the more influential were men like A.L. Smith, Namier's and Leeper's history tutor. who supported the thriving Fabian Society in college and also the WEA, for whom summer schools in Balliol were organised. As for the undergraduate population, while there were inevitably yahoos and proto-Bullingdonites, especially in one notorious drunken dining club, Annandale, the general atmosphere was quite different, serious-minded and politically progressive. One old Balliol man later observed that the typical college product in the Edwardian period was Clement Attlee. And it was these people with whom Leeper socialised. They included some influential individuals, none perhaps more so than Ludwig Bernstein, who became Lewis Namier, whose distaste for the Habsburg Empire produced a strong sympathy, claims to independence from its subject peoples, and who certainly lent Leeper the works of Robert Seton Watson, the founder of the New Europe Group, who made the same point in relation to Europe, not relation to Ireland. Namier's attitude to Ireland was rather complex. He idealized the British Empire, that has to be said, as a force for good in the world, fundamentally different from the Austrian, Russian, or Ottoman Empire. Clearly, the rights of subject peoples from Africa or Asia or even Ireland didn't rank as high for him as Czechs and Slovaks and Romanians and so on. But Ireland presented a problem. Like Leeper, he saw the country in its relationship to Britain as an anomaly, and any refusal to make concessions to the majority population as a threat to the moral integrity and international reputation of the empire. And he was particularly concerned with the reputation of the empire in America, because he did a lot of round table imperialists at the time. He did see the need to bring the sundered brethren of the United States back into some connection with the empire. There's one other possible and interesting source of influence within Leeper's own family. His uncle by marriage, Balliol Somerville, who some of you may know about. Naval officer and hydrographer, underwater cartographer, who'd met and married one of Adeline's sisters while on service in the Pacific and Australasia. Somerville was the brother of the novelist Edith Somerville, Somerville and Ross, and was a County Cork Protestant with an unusual Anglo-Irish outlook. He was interested in the Irish language, and he was a convinced Home Ruler. Now, none of this would prevent him from being shot dead on his own doorstep by the IRA in the 1930s on grounds that he was recruiting for the British Armed Forces, when what he'd done was to sign, his family said, 2 reference letters for young men who come to see him wanting to join the Royal Navy. Anyway, be that as it may. Allen met him several times and admired him a good deal. He said nothing of these meetings really, when he wrote to his father, except to describe Boyle's work, Uncle Boyle's work, mapping the seabed in various parts of the Atlantic, or perhaps sometimes recounting Uncle Boyle's facility with Irish ballads of the Percy French variety. But it would really be surprising, I think, if political affairs hadn't figured at some point in their discussions. Now, the letters more or less begin to fade away as this talk is beginning to fade away in 1911. When Allen took a first-class honours degree in grapes, which he kept telling his father he wasn't going to get, he did get it in the end. For some reason, he began a second, I think because he couldn't think of a job to do. He wanted to join the British Museum, but they turned him down. So he began a second BA degree, this time in modern history. Then during his first year, he, to his own surprise, got a letter from the British Museum saying, would you like a job after all? And the job he got was in the Department of Assyrian Antiquities. So he spoke to his history tutor, who was A.L. Smith, who said, if I were you, I'd take it because the alternative is interesting. If you saw this as the alternative from Australia, or schoolmastering, teaching in a public school, or teaching history at some colonial university, which was clearly the equivalent of schoolmastering. And indeed, Smith had tried to get Namier a job in Canada the year before, even before he finished his degree. Canadians didn't fancy him because actually he was Jewish. It's another story. There was no choice, really. He took the job in Assyrian antiquities and spent the next 3 or 4 years, 2 years, transcribing cuneiform tablets. He rather liked it. He told Roland Bryce, life in the museum is rather good. Fossilization, he said, is a pleasant sensation. Then came the First World War. Created havoc among Allen's Balliol contemporaries. The leading figures among the Annandale set were nearly all killed in the First World War, memorialized immediately afterwards. People like Patrick Shaw Stewart, the war poet with a single war poem to his credit, the Grenfell brothers, Charles Lister, and people like this, whom Ron Knox wrote about, and many others, including Ronnie Poulton Palmer, the great rugby player, who was shot dead by a German sniper, having been told by what must be the most stupid officer in the British Army, even in the British Army during the First World War, to stand on a parapet supervising the digging of a trench. He was then promptly shot in the head. His last words were apparently, "I shall never play at Twickenham again." Pathetic, but also rather pathetic. No less than 11 of the undergraduates whom Leeper knew very well were killed in the First World War or died of wounds. Others, like G.N. Clark, spent time as prisoners of war. Allen himself tried to enlist, but was rejected on medical grounds because of his bad chest. So he found a place in the War Propaganda Bureau at Wellington House, where he was reuniting with 2 Balliol friends, Bernstein, now naturalized as Lewis Namier, and Arnold Toynbee. All 3 moved in 1916 to the Intelligence Bureau of the Department of Information or Misinformation, in fact, where they were joined by Rex Leeper, who'd been invalided out of the Indian Army, and by 1 or 2 other Balliol cronies. And in February 1918, the Intelligence Bureau was transferred lock, stock, and barrel to the Foreign Office, where it became the Political Intelligence Department, or PID. At that point, all of the people who were working for the PID were really in the orbit of Robert Seton Watson. Seton Watson was in charge. They all wrote for the New Europe magazine. And Leeper himself took a great deal of interest in the fate of Romania. And he wrote a book about Romanians' right to self-determination. So nothing as far as we know about Ireland. At the end of the war didn't mean the end of the PID, and both Allen and Rex stayed on. In fact, they were both at the peace conference in Paris in 1920, which in many respects must have seemed like a college reunion, given the number of Balliol men present in various capacities. Allen then stayed on the Foreign Office after the Treaty of Versailles, and becoming assistant private secretary to Curzon, the Foreign Secretary. Married in 1921, and he and his wife spent most of the 1920s in Vienna, where he was first secretary, before he came back to become head of the League of Nations and Western Department. And here's a picture of him with his father around 1930, when he's not actually looking very healthy, and the father is looking rather decrepit. And indeed, he fell ill in 1934 for some reason, some illness which he never diagnosed, had several unsuccessful operations, and died in 1935 of a ruptured gallbladder. His brother Rex stayed on much longer in the Foreign Office, became Sir Reginald Leeper, KCMG, and is principally remembered as the architect of the British Council. The young man who emerges from the letters is a curious mixture of the adult and juvenile, capable of perceptive and mature judgments, but also naively enthusiastic. But despite fully sharing the snobbery and racism of the time, he comes over generally as an attractive and fair-minded young man whose capacity for making and keeping friends speaks for itself. His letters, which back to the first slide, not only provide us with a window into a world which was shortly to vanish, they testify to a society made deeply uncomfortable by political crisis and social change, and they contain glimpses of emerging modernity. Air displays by aviation pioneers, for example, which he greeted with youthful enthusiasm, and innovative movements in painting, of which he was rather more doubtful. Altogether, they bring out the complexities as well as the colour of a critical period in British and world history. They are available to order, and they're available to read online, and not available to pick up.
Not yet. We do have a lot of questions. They'd like to ask.
Do you say anything about the exclusion of members?
No, nothing. Things that as you just supplement it, just eat it, accept it, very well. And in fact, there won't be any Rome rule because some Catholics will very mature and reject errors. So there's nothing about it. There's a lot about Irish history from a very nationalist perspective, starting off with Henry II.
What have you read?
No, I don't think he read very much. He read broadly. So he condemns every point of English oppression from quite happily. So of course it doesn't matter. You can imagine Swallow on the bristling